Thank you very much, Professor Raina. Too many questions personally, but since we're running a little late on time, and we also have the great privilege of having Professor Irfan Habib here, perhaps you'd like to comment, start a quick discussion between you two in the 10 minutes, I believe, that we have. 10, 15?
Yeah, I have just 15 minutes to use. Not very much to say because I didn't know that he's going to present such an elaborate comments on Iran and just suppose India and China. And I didn't have the text, so I just heard it here for the first time. What I want to point out is a few things with which Dhruv began and which both of us have been engaged discussing in the context of India, in the context of Iran. And while I had this privilege of going through the book he mentioned, which is Soon here, and I read it last week, and a couple of things which came to my mind, and one thing which struck me, I don't know whether Dhruv will agree with that, was that Needham's excitement with Needham's historiography and Needham's work on China surely, as Dhruv pointed out, excited lots of people in India. And unfortunately, and I will call it unfortunately, because most of the excitement which we see in India in that period, the 1950s, began actually from 40s, but from 1950s onwards, when the first volume of Science and Civilization was out, and before, after that particularly, most of the excitement was confined to people from sciences. The historiography did not really make much impact among historians. That was unfortunate. There were one or two cases we can, and Dhruv has pointed out the name of my namesake, Prof. Irfan, who was impacted by Joseph Needham, but again, very marginally. We don't see in his work Needham's historiographical issues or questions which Needham wrote about or raised about being used very often by Irfan himself, except for some of his work on technology, that's all, where he compares China and India. That also very late in 2000, not even before that. Then we have a case of a philosopher of the Prashant Chattopadhyay, which Dhruv talks about, who seriously engaged in Needhamian questions and tried to see India in the light of what the questions he raised in the context of China. Besides these two, everybody else actually comes from science. And right from Rahman to D.M. Bose to Kosambi, so many others, mathematicians and scientists and all that. Historians are almost untouched by what Needham has done to historiography in the context of China. And it was not really in the context of China alone. He opened up the whole issue of the looking at the Northwest and some new questions, new tools which he tried to use for China could be used for other parts of the world as well, which people did. Now, in the case of India, when you confine, and I don't know whether Dhruv will remember, once we were talking about, I will not name him, we were talking to a very, and we were surprised, both of us, a very, very senior and very good historian, and I rate him very high. In the mid-90s, we were talking to him, and when we raised this issue of Joseph Needham, we wanted to organize a conference, which we did in 1996, and we raised this issue that we want to do this conference in that particular place where he was in charge. He was surprised that he didn't know the name Joseph Needham, and we had to really introduce to him that who Joseph Needham was, what he stood for, and why we need to celebrate him after his death, his work. So so that was a level of ignorance about Needham's work till mid-90s, till Needham died. So Needham's work, unfortunately, on China, which opened up so many issues, so many questions, didn't really do very much among the historians in India. And even today, Needham remains almost marginal. We don't see Nidham being referred to in any of the references of Indian historians who are working on economic history, on history of technology, on so many other things where Nidham actually is relevant, or even on social history, or anti-colonial sort of historiography or history writing. Nidham is very, very marginal. So this is something which, while reading Dhruv's book, it struck me. This is what Nidham has done to India. He has not really been very, very. We talk about him, but we don't really use him or his work very, very much the way it should be used. Now, despite that, there were issues in the anti-colonial or post-colonial phase which were raised by lots of people, like you also wondered about cognitive justice, which Nidham inspired people to talk about. Epistemological egalitarianism, people talked about. So these were issues which not historians but others raised it. People who were working in science policy, people who were working in sciences particularly, or in sociology, etc. But these issues also were not raised by historians per se in India, which is something surprising, and I related now to the non-emergence of history of science in the universities. And this was a period after the independence in the 1940s and 50s where new disciplines were emerging. History of science just didn't appear anywhere. In the new university setup, new courses being taught, history of science remains absent till today. So even Joseph Nidham couldn't inspire our historians, and that is one reflection, and I will end here. Historians didn't really bother to actually begin this new area which has raked up all sorts of issues all over the world and inspired people all over the world. Despite the fact that Nidham was talking about China, but people in Latin America, people in Brazil particularly, we have lots of friends in Brazil and Argentina who are Nidhamians, who are inspired by Nidham, and who use his work to look at their own societies, own sciences and technology. But unfortunately, we didn't do that in India. Thank you.
So the question of absences that Nidham pointed out is ironically reflected back in historiography.
It turns around reflexively, yes, absolutely.
I think we can still manage a few extra questions, so please, anybody, this is a very precious opportunity to hear from very leading specialists in the field. If there's, yes, please.
First of all, I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. Partly because when I teach my course on Chinese civilization, we have a huge section of science and technology in China. But quite apart from that, this whole Nidham question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay, that's fine. Okay. I just. The Nidham question was actually inverted, I think, by some of his students, like Nathan Simon, for example, who then said,
they were the first critics of his work.
Yes, that's right. And then who said, let's ask the question not why China didn't have a scientific revolution, but why China had one, and the West didn't have one when China had one. Right? So in a sense, I think that debate within historians of science and technology in China has been very much alive. So the whole issue of the theory of absences doesn't quite hold in relation to the kind of critique that people like Nathan Simon made of Nidham's question. I just want your response to that.
Yeah. No, in the Indian context, the theory of absences remained precisely because, in a way, the Indian social science community in the 50s was very, very closely tied up with modernization theory, with sociology, with those kinds of concerns. And that's the point that I tried to make at the end, that some of scholars working in China didn't carry that burden, one. But on the other hand, you're right that, with Nathan Simon, we begin to see a turning point in the Western historiography of Chinese science. That is the turning point. After Simon and Roger Hart, and the entire tradition then moves away from that historiography. Yeah, but there's just one more point I'd like to bring up having to do with what Varun said. That somehow ideas of, I mean, what you ask about China is what you ask about India. So in the 17th century you say, what did the Jesuits do in China? And then of course they go and meet the emperor, and then you say, what did the Jesuits do in India? And in India you say, which emperor did they meet, or which ruler did they meet? I mean, India is not then the kind of state we're talking about as China is. So the question itself has to be nuanced in a very different way.
If I might come back quickly, but it's remarkable what you say about Jesuits being the only network of scientists, because it's true among anthropologists and historians. They are remarkably accurate throughout this time. The reports are usually something you can rely on that reflects very well prevailing conditions. I have a quick question. I know I'm stealing the floor here, but I think it is pertinent. The kind of reasoning that leads to early modern and modern science in Europe, I think, might be traced to what Philip Dvorsky has called the disciplinary revolution. Have you heard about this? The notion of Calvinism.
Yes, yeah, sure.
As being the substrand within the Protestant world that actually enables scientific reasoning to that extent. Now he looks at it from a political science perspective, saying this is why these nations actually go and conquer the rest of the world more than others. I'm thinking perhaps if we further refine our resolution into what kind of scientific progress is made where, maybe that's kind of the idea is that the discipline, the self-discipline that comes with Calvinism, very kind of austere practices, are those that enable this kind of, I think, this is a leap here, he says that's what enables the growth of nation states, modern nation states with a very strict bureaucracy. We could try and find maybe a link towards sciences there, and then look for...
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, now that you talked about Calvinism, I was immediately reminded of a book by a professor at Harvard, a Sanskritist called George Beckman. A book called The Warriors of the Cloister, the Central Asian Origins of Modern Science. And what he speaks about are that in the works of, and he sees Vasubandhu as a Central Asian Buddhist and not from the South, and he makes a very strong distinction between Central Asian Buddhism and Indian Buddhism. And he says in the works of Vasubandhu and others, you already have a particular kind of social structure within which certain kinds of questions are asked, and there is a rational procedure of argumentation which begins to develop, which he calls the recursive method, which travels through Islam into the Western world subsequently. So that's another work, but that's not something, now that you mention Calvinism, my mind immediately goes to Beckwith's work on Buddhism, but I'm not taking a view on either. I mean, I don't know enough.
Please, the floor is still open. We still have time for a few questions. It doesn't necessarily have to be very historical. I'm sorry, I brought my own biases. Yes, please.
Thank you. Episodically, I think you said that Indian historians haven't thought about Needham at all. And I remember, I think as early as 1976, of course that dates me, I was talking to Deva Mukti once, right, the historian, and she was very concerned about looking at Needham and the history of science, etc. But I think the structure of historiography and historical discipline in India at that time was extremely perhaps materialist and Marxist, and it didn't actually tolerate, I think, anything outside that framework in a sense. So there was, I think, some kind of a problem perhaps with opening up these kinds of areas for research. That was my clear sense of what I was getting from the last 20 years of the history writing. That I think some of the areas that we have ignored have perhaps been ignored because we have been too wedded to a certain kind.
Yeah, but Needham himself in the 1950s and the failure of Needham himself in the 1950s, they were his good friends like Samrendranath Sen, who wrote the history of scientific institutions in colonial India. He was his friend. He had worked with Needham at UNESCO, and he felt Needham was too much of a Marxist materialist. And the criticism of Needham throughout the 1950s, I mean, Indian scientists who were doing history of science, except for the exception of people like Rahman and Devi Prasad Chattopadhyay and historians like Irfan Habib and D.D. Kosambi. The others avoided that. So you wanted a Nidhemian history without Nidhemian historiography.
Yes.
All right, and yeah.
Like in the case of for Needham, other people have Dhruv also mentioned it, I don't know. Like Needham, because he was in two worlds, he was a Marxist and he was a
Christian.
He was a Christian. So he did both the words and all his life till the end of till he died. So in that case, lots of Marxists didn't really didn't want to really go along with him and what he really said. But in the case of India, Irfan Habib actually is the only, one can say, Marxist. D.D. Kosambi almost didn't meet him. No, I don't know. I'm not saying that this was the reason, but he didn't really spend much time with him when Needham came to India. He went to Bombay and I think Needham
3 minutes.
Spent 3 minutes. No, just 3 minutes with him. So why did he do that? Difficult to explain. But most of the Marxists there, in those days there were not many different views of Marxism. There were only one dogmatic Marxism. Today you have different views of Marxism. There is no one Marxism at all. So in 1950s and 60s there were only dogmatic Marxists. One variety of Marxists. So they didn't really find too much comfort with him. And because he was a Christian, he was not really a proper Marxist. So
yes,
that way.
I guess what I'm saying, the politics of history writing in this country, I think, has taken a turn.
You see, in the 1950s, I just like to come to one more point in the 1950s. In the 1950s, correct?
No, please after that.
Yeah. In the 1950s, for example, people like Needham, J.D. Bernal, Walter Pagels, in the 1940s, and this is the work of the two students of Simon Schaeffer, Anna Meyer and Christopher Chilvers. I mean, these people were battling for a strong historiography of science. You know, it was a battle for historicity. They were breaking away from scientific presentism, you know, and saying, no, you want to do history of science, you have to make the history of science matter to the present of science. All right, which means you had to be a philologist, you had to learn history, you had to learn. So it was the whole thing which the Indian scientific community, I mean, not one of them at that time who came to history of science was trained as a historian. You know.
I just a couple of thoughts on this. You know, I think one is that, you know, Needham himself was always very suspicious of India, and that in some ways is linked to his wartime experience in China, and you know the whole experience, and a deep suspicion about the fact that, you know, in India, the state that had emerged was really in some ways a very neat successor state of sort of, you know, the British Empire. I mean, that was something which always sort of, you know, in a way he was always, you know, critical of Nehru in a way, and of the whole sort of Nehruvian project. And you know, 1962, he's very clear, you know, on, you know, who he thinks is right. You know, and he's very clear about that. But there's another thing also that I think, you know, this discussion that is circling around, we need to reflect on, which is that there are very clear hierarchies of knowledge. And you know, the natural sciences in the, you know, in scala intellectualis, as it were, are above the social and the human sciences. And in a very fundamental way, there's an asymmetric filter there. So Needham could move from the natural sciences into the human sciences, but that contrary movement really doesn't take place. And so there's also a question really about who is equipped to do that. You know, so if you are a trained historian, are you even equipped? You know, do you even have the basic tools to sort of, you know, understand science? You know, do you really understand what a molecule is, for example? I mean, so I think somewhere out there, the question you're asking about why there isn't, you know, why it doesn't sort of, you know, Indian historiography doesn't reflect it. I think is that basic point, that we've built a basic structure of knowledge where you cannot move. If you started out in the human and social sciences, you cannot invade the territory of the natural sciences, and you know, whereas the reverse is always possible. That's my sense.
Can I say something? I think it's a more, what shall we say, it's a different kind of problem. I mean, there's a problem of competencies, of course, if you bring a certain kind of competency to a study of a certain thing, you're probably better at it, you probably will do it and extend that area as well. But I think it's also a question of how we have perceived the writing of history in this country, and what we think is the proper history that history is in, or the proper domain of history. And I think, for example, we really seriously don't have in our universities any department of, say, or serious discipline of the history of religion, for example, right? Which I think is extremely relevant to at least be able to have a rational approach to a study of the history of religion. We tend to not look at these things as being relevant to the scope of history writing in this country. And I think the history of science is very much falls within that category of what we don't consider as the scope, the proper domain of history writing. We have narrowed our conception of what it means to do history.
Don't disagree with you, but all I'll say in literally one sentence is that for much of his career, Needham found that historians at Cambridge didn't consider him a historian either.
Which is why why he set up the Needham Research Institute. Sinologists, they can say this. Marginal there.
Thank you very much for this wonderful talk, just so we don't drink tea here at the table while everybody else is watering. So thank you very much, Professor Sani, Professor Raina, Professor Habib, and guests.